I feel like with today's speaker, we are truly living up to the ambitious title, Tech Leadership Lab, where we have with us Chad Dickerson, the former CEO of Etsy, who's going to be talking to us about his journey. Chad, I'm not going to give a really long introduction of you, but instead I'm going to dive right in and sort
Great.
of let you do it yourself. But I knew you when you were running Etsy. I always had a great deal of admiration for your leadership style and for what all the people who worked for you would say about you. Sort of like, the bright, shining look in their eyes when they would describe you. And
Wow.
so I feel like it's really special to have you sharing your leadership lessons with our students. I feel like a theme of today's conversation is going to be, moving from one thing to the next thing, metamorphosis, change, sort of evolution. I figured we'd start with, well, not really at the very beginning, but your pre-Etsy journey.
Yeah.
When we were just chatting, you mentioned to me that you were an English major who became a software engineer.
Yeah.
And then, sort of after a couple of steps, you were the CTO of Etsy. So, what was that journey like? How did that unfold?
Yeah. I grew up in North Carolina, so I'm like a native Southerner. I've been in New York for like 18 years, and I was in the Bay Area for 10 years before that. I did get an English degree at Duke with a focus on Shakespeare. And the way the Duke curriculum works, you can choose to opt out of different subject areas. And I opted completely out of science, and you could take only 2 classes in another area, and that was math. So how I ended up as a CTO after opting out of science and math,
Well,
essentially.
I've always felt that Shakespeare has a lot of good leadership lessons in it.
Shakespeare has a ton of leadership lessons. You learn a lot about writing and communication, and anyone who's been in a tough board meeting is, you're like, man, this is like Julius Caesar, the knives are out. And we'll talk more about that.
Yeah.
I'd say the key moment in my career that anyone who's paid attention to anything I've done or read about it is often like not represented. I wanted to work around journalists, so I went to work at a newspaper in Raleigh, North Carolina when I got out of college, and I was really aimless and didn't know what I wanted to do. I had an English degree. I got a clerical job, but this newspaper the News and Observer happened to be the first daily newspaper on the web in the United States. And so I was doing clerical work in this department, and there were kind of, people who looked really tired who were doing like HTML, and there were books and like programming books. And I started asking questions, and they started explaining it to me and giving me like little programming tasks. So that was really the beginning of my kind of love affair with software and the web. I thought it was so cool that you could publish something and it would immediately be out in the whole world, because I was working in a building where they loaded, newspapers into a truck every day and like put them out into that area. This was like 1994. I was working at that newspaper when Mosaic, the first internet browser, came out, from Mark Andreessen, who is an interesting guy these days too.
Yes.
And I've met him before. I was sort of accidentally a pioneer. So the newspaper in Atlanta, which was the 10th largest newspaper in the country at the time, was looking for someone to run their web operation. Long story short, I got hired to run the web operation in Atlanta, and I was 23. From there, my career kind of accelerated. I worked at CNN in its early days, the early days of CNN.com. We were the #1 news site on the web at the time. And as a quick side note, the company Akamai that delivers most of the traffic on the internet, that team was at CNN developing Akamai based on the kind of news spikes that we would get. So I got to see the early Akamai team build one of the kind of iconic internet infrastructure companies. But I was getting a little sort of fatigued of like the 24/7 news environment. It's like really, really intense. And the web combined. I was sitting at my desk in Atlanta. I saw that this online magazine named Salon.com, which was a big deal in the late 90s. It was kind of like the New Yorker of the web, was looking for a VP of technology. And they were known as kind of like a literary kind of magazine. And so I sent them a cover letter and said, I'm the only Shakespeare major who's going to write to you and want this job. And so they called me immediately, and that's what took me out to the West Coast.
See, these are completely unexpected job search tips that you're getting from this talk as well.
Yeah.
We don't make that up unless you're actually a Shakespeare expert.
Salon went public while I was there. I was in San Francisco for the 1999 dot-com boom and then the bust. Salon went public, and I'm sure some of you are studying like IPOs and things like that. Salon did a Dutch auction IPO, and we were a test case for the next Dutch auction IPO because this investment bank called W.R. Hambrecht was running this IPO. Does anyone know what that Dutch auction IPO was? Google. Yeah. So if you read about the history of IPOs, the Google IPO was a big deal. So we went public at $15. A year and a half later, I sold my stock for 23 cents. And I went to work at an IT trade magazine where I used my English degree for the first time, and I wrote a column for CTOs for about 5 years. And then from there, there was a time at Yahoo, which is pretty diminished now, but Web 2.0 was happening, like Flickr and social sharing, and kind of what MySpace was happening, and Yahoo had made some acquisitions in that space and was kind of really hot. And a good friend of mine, Katerina Fake, was the co-founder of Flickr, and she invited me over to Yahoo, and I went to Yahoo in 2005 and was there up to 2008 working on innovation kind of generally, like, sort of small, nimble teams in the company, worked on a little M&A.
That was a really interesting time for Yahoo.
Yeah, it's hard to explain here in 2025.
Yeah.
But I worked with Jeff Weiner, who went on to run LinkedIn, and I learned a lot from Jeff. And that was like a really seminal moment. I worked with Stuart Butterfield, who went on to start a little company called Slack that has taken over the world. And many, many other people. A good friend of mine, Bradley Horowitz, who went on to be a Google executive. It was a really, really special time. But Stuart and Katerina were married at the time, and they were like on the cover of Time and Newsweek and all this kind of stuff. They put an angel investment in Etsy, and so they were close to Etsy, and the Etsy team, they thought, really needed a technology leader. And so for months and months and months, they were telling me I was living in Berkeley, California at the time. I'd just gotten married, I was renovating my house. They kept telling me to go out and meet with the Etsy team. And I kept saying no because I was busy and didn't want to come out to New York. So I finally relented, I think probably in July 2008. I sent an email to a few friends saying that this was a vacation interview. I was just going out to have fun in New York, and I wasn't planning to move there. And this is still in my email archive. That was July 2008. And then my first day at Etsy was like September 3rd, 2008. So I was really charmed by Etsy. I met Rob Kalin, the founder. The first interaction I had with Rob was he sent me a piece of pirated music that he thought I would like, which is so fitting with Etsy's kind of anarchic culture. After being in Silicon Valley for 10 years, I came out there because I was so excited because you would be in the grocery store and you would hear people talking about technology.
Yeah.
10 years of that, and I was like, I'm tired of hearing everybody talk about technology. And every party you go to, everyone's a product manager or an engineer.
And then you were the CTO for 3 years, and we'll keep on the sort of the linear time scale kind of. So as you were the CTO for 3 years, and then you made this sort of big transition from being the CTO to the CEO.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about how that came about? And then
it was almost like accidental in a way. So I joined Etsy. The very first week, the site went down for an hour. The team really did not want me there. Like I was hired as the leader, but it was more of like a top-down decision. And so I remember my first day at Etsy, that September 3rd, 2008. I walked in and someone pointed me to my desk, and on my desk were like a bunch of empty beer and liquor bottles. And there were 4 kind of co-founders, but the 2 technical ones, they decided to leave because I was coming, and they had a big party that Friday, and they didn't clean up. So it was a startup, so there wasn't like a lot of organization. So the first thing I had to do on my first day was like, I remember getting a garbage can, the recycling can, and just kind of running my hand across and everything just going clang, clang, clang into the garbage, and then sitting down and looking out at a team that did not want me there.
Yeah.
Which anyone who's come into a situation that needs to be kind of turned around has had that experience. There was a lot of rebuilding during that time. I was interviewing an engineer, right when I came out, a week into the job, and I got a text that the site was down, and I was at a bar with the engineer, and I didn't want to terrify him, so I said I needed to go to the bathroom, and so I went to the bathroom, was doing all this stuff, but and then I came back, it's oh yeah, sorry, I took a while. So it's just really, really chaotic. There was a lot of change that needed to happen, and I had to refactor the team. And so in the first, I think, 9 months, I replaced 17 of the 20 on the engineering team and brought in some really amazing people, some of whom I worked with out on the West Coast. And we went from a really struggling engineering organization, I think, at that time to being kind of a pioneer in some of the big things that were happening. We were really early with what's called continuous deployment, which is pretty common now. And so the team was in really good shape. I there was a CEO transition. So I was sitting at Etsy with almost not even quite 3 years in, and I was looking at the third CEO change. And so Fred Wilson, the Union Square Ventures investor who was on Etsy's board, was telling me we're going to hire a new CEO. And he introduced me to someone named Jerry Colonna. Jerry's a really well-known executive coach. I didn't know who he was. And I started meeting with Jerry, and I was telling my wife at home what was happening, and I was saying, there's going to be a new CEO, I don't know who it's going to be. And I think in my second session with Jerry, he had been talking to other people, and I'll never forget this. I just met Jerry, and we're really close friends now. Jerry said to me, let me tell you why you should be the CEO. And I was like, what? I went off to work that morning saying, I wonder who's going to be the CEO. I came back that night and I told my wife that I wanted to be the CEO. And I'll never forget, this is 100% true. She said, I don't want to be married to a CEO. She's like, I don't like CEOs. And
yet you went ahead anyway.
Yeah. And this is I'll tell you the truth. I've told this story a few times, but it's not widely out there. So then I had to tell Fred Wilson, who's essentially running the board. I told Fred, I want to be CEO, and this is a direct quote as I remember it. He said, "Shit." He said, "Now if we don't," "Now if we don't make you CEO, then you're going to leave, and we're going to have to get a CTO and a CEO." He was like, we thought this wasn't going to work. So. I think one reason he said that is they had brought in a COO named Adam Freed, and Adam still lives in New York and is a VC and is a really great guy. And Adam was an early Google guy, spoke 9 languages, went to Harvard Business School. So he was really well put together and well spoken, and I was a little bit more of a rougher engineer. And so the key thing, and I've thanked Adam for this, is so Fred went to Adam and said, I thought we were going to make you the CEO, and Adam said, Chad should be the CEO, I will work for him. And so everyone was totally shocked. Yeah. And so I think
what was really different? I mean, I mean, when you're a CTO, you're leading a technology organization.
Yeah.
And when you're a CEO, you're leading the organization. I mean, but as someone transitioning from leading the tech organization to leading the organization, what sort of what are the big differences? I mean, what made you?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. There are all kinds of books about being a CEO and all this kind of stuff. But the thing that I remember the most is that, well, when you think about org charts, people kind of think about a ladder. You're CTO, and you go up one rung, and you're the CEO. But it's an order of magnitude change. And so, I'd been a CTO a few times, and before that, in other kinds of teams, and I always felt like I was a responsible teammate. I didn't blame other people. I didn't say this isn't working because of marketing, whatever. Sometimes I did in my mind, and I just remember the feeling of becoming CEO and realizing that every problem in the company was now mine. And so it's ultimate responsibility. No one to blame but yourself, and that's a pretty heavy feeling. And so maybe this will happen to some of you. I was, I think I was well regarded in the company, but people hadn't seen me be CEO. And when I was running the engineering team, I thought I built a really great engineering team. And so people saw me as the engineering leader.
Yeah.
And to some degree, the engineering team was working better than the other teams because the CEO is getting replaced, so those teams hadn't been developed as much. And so the thing that I didn't think about was like what that would be like as an internal candidate. So I'll never immediately, I had a few days notice, but I told the engineering team, I'm the CEO now. I'm getting out of all the engineering like IRC channels, but pre-Slack. I'm getting off all the mailing lists. We appointed a new CTO. I don't answer any questions about technology. The CTO reports to me, and now it's a CEO-CTO relationship. I'm not just like the CTO plus. And so I kind of like pushed them aside. And then I had a team, some of whom were my peers, and that was kind of interesting. And there were changes that needed to be made, and that was interesting. But about a week into the job, I remember I had 2 meetings in a row. The first meeting was when the engineering leaders, and they told me, we feel like you don't pay any attention to us anymore. And then I had a meeting with a few of the like business side leaders, and they said, we think all you care about is engineering.
Engineers, yeah.
And I was just like, oh my gosh, like you can't win. So that was a challenge of like being an internal candidate.
Yeah.
The other thing is, suddenly it's almost like being the president when you start getting the national security briefing or something. You just know a lot of things. Like I worked in the company for 3 years, and then I looked back at the last financing round, and I was like, who got secondary in that last financing round? There were like all kinds of details that were interesting and surprising. I just remember like the weight on my shoulders. But I also remember like one of the great things about being a CEO is like you own the culture of the company. And so there were things that I thought needed to change. And as the CEO, you can start changing them immediately.
So it's really empowering.
It is.
I mean, does it?
It's a lot of responsibility, but you can you aren't a subject anymore of someone else's whims.
I realize this is sort of a textbooky kind of question,
Yeah.
but I am a professor after all.
Yeah.
And so like we are in a classroom. But my sense has always been that how you lead is shaped in part by who you are, but it's also shaped in part by the role.
Yeah.
And so looking back, do you see, like, are there 1 or 2 things that you can point to that changed in your leadership style because you were in this new role, feeling the weight on your shoulders? Or was the way you managed as a CEO just same as the way as you managed as a CDO, just with a different group of people in a different scope?
Yeah, there was like one really key thing changed. Let me give you some context. So like, those of you who are sort of connect to the tech side, like the engineering side, especially when I was kind of coming up in that world, like open source culture is like a really big thing, like Linux and all this kind of stuff. And the idea that you have these really important projects where like everyone kind of democratically contributes, and it's very egalitarian. It's all about kind of merit and skill, and that's a good thing in a lot of ways. And so when you run an engineering organization, that open source culture kind of often like permeates. And those of you who've worked in tech companies, the engineers are kind of just unruly people. And so, and they'll speak their minds and like without hesitation. So I think I ran that team a little bit more in that model where I was like listening to a lot of people, and it was a little bit more egalitarian and not really consensus driven, but it had that sort of kind of open source feel where you kind of listen to everyone. So if you're a CEO, I think if you're a smart CEO, it's kind of hard to get feedback. So it's kind of important to request that you get like a 360 review, because the HR processes in a company don't really take into account like reviewing the CEO. That's mainly the board job. So I worked with my coach, Jerry Colonna, and we ran a 360 probably a year in where he interviewed people who worked with me, interviewed the board. And one of the bits of feedback I got was that I was a little bit too egalitarian, and people kind of wanted me to make faster decisions.
I see.
And tell them what to do. And so I thought people would feel better if I listened to what they had to say and got all the input. And one of the things I learned, and I've seen this I've coached now in 60 or 70 companies, is that people tell you they want to participate in the decision making, and they do to a certain extent, but when you're a CEO, people really want you to make decisions and tell them, this is where we're going, like this is roughly how we're going to do it, you're all going to take out the details. So I think over the course of 6 years as CEO, I became a lot more comfortable with that, of just saying this is where we're going, and I got better feedback on that.
That's really interesting, because that's also it's a great position to be in, but it's also like the buck stops with you.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's nice to have other people sort of sharing in the decisions. But let's sort of go. Let's move to that 6-year phase, right? Because you've described it, I think, to me and perhaps to others as sort of roughly 3 chunks, right? You had the sort of the chaos to orderly company. You had the orderly company, the IPO, and then you had the running the public company.
Yeah.
I don't have a specific question here. It's more like what. Because, I mean, you were incredibly successful from a growing revenue point of view. I mean, 14x revenue growth. And this is when Etsy really sort of exploded on the scene. But, why do you split it up into these 3 phases? And what characterized them? Which phase did you enjoy the most?
Yeah. I would say, and it almost fits perfectly when I look back, like the first 2 years, the kind of like sort of stepping into the job and kind of the dysfunction, there was not really like a head of HR, like a head of people. There wasn't a head of marketing. Like I had to, after building an engineering team, I had to hire all these people. One of the things that I learned, I guess it's not surprising, but the extent of it was surprising, is that when you're the CEO of something, like everybody will talk to you.
Yeah.
So you're like, you get tickets to games and like restaurant reservations, and people invite you to parties, and like they call you, and just So if I wanted to hire a CFO, I would talk to the board and say, like, who are the best CFOs in the world, and they would introduce me to them, and I would meet them. So the first 2 years, I mean, you never stopped learning. There was a lot of like building out the team, but also like quickly learning the different functions. And so I think the fact that I told the engineering team that I wasn't going to deal with engineering, because I kind of knew about that, was actually really strategic, because I needed all the time to like work on the other things. So that was kind of invigorating and a little intimidating not intimidating, but like it was this a whole world opened up. You also become a little bit, for a company that people knew as well as Etsy, like a little bit of a public figure. And so
was that exciting? Was that scary?
I don't think I would liked it that much, because you'd be working like really hard. I live in Brooklyn, and most Etsy employees lived in Brooklyn, and you'd like squeeze in a date night, and I had a young kid at home, so it was like difficult. Squeeze in a date night with your wife, and you're like, let's just go to a few bars, have some drinks, and like every bar you go to, there's somebody who knows you and wants to talk to you, and that would
sounds
get
like
old.
a really good problem to have, frankly.
It's kind of cool, and then it's not. But so I was adjusting like life and everything else.
And then you started to sort of like how long before the company went public did that start to become the thing where you're saying like we're gearing up to go public?
So the period I just talked about was like 2011, 2013. And then I feel like in January, we started talking about when to go public, like in the board. And there was always this idea that Etsy would go public. Like even before I joined Etsy in 2008, and Rob Kalin, the founder, said to the Wall Street Journal, like, I want Etsy to be a public company. And so, after I left Etsy, there were people who said, why did you, like, Etsy shouldn't have gone public. Why did Etsy go public? And I was like, well, we told the Wall Street Journal in 2007 we were going public. It was like in the air. That period was about stability, and probably I feel like it was like January 2014, we had a board meeting where we said we're definitely going to go public. We went public in April 2015. And so I would say 2013 to 2015 was like building out the management team, because when you go public, there are 2 positions that you really need to get right, and that's the CFO, because that's kind of the voice to the street, and then your general counsel, because like the legal stuff that you deal with becomes much more intense. So that 2013 to 2015 period, like building out the team and kind of, I was also building an independent board of directors. If you don't, maybe you study this in your classes, but like venture-backed startups, the board members are often investors, but public company rules and exchange rules, like NASDAQ, New York Stock Exchange, you basically have to build an independent board. So you need
like Tesla, for example.
I would suggest another example. And so as the CEO, technically the CEO isn't responsible. The nominating committee of the board like puts directors on the board, but I was also heavily involved in recruiting independent directors. So during that period, not only did I have to kind of build the kind of next generation like IPO ready management team, I had to, working with the board, reshape the board, which included like having to meet with your investors, some investors, and saying, I need you to leave the board.
Yeah.
And so, because it's kind of a one-for-one trade. So I had to, and all our investors were great, but I had to have some uncomfortable conversations where like every investor thinks I'm going to ask someone else to leave the board. And I'm like, no, I'm asking you to leave the board. All good people, great investors. So that period was like a lot of anticipation. We had to do like a lot of compliance stuff, which was not fun at all, like Sarbanes-Oxley and all accounting kind of stuff. And we had to write our S1 filing for the SEC, where to some degree, even though everyone knows, or a lot of people knew about Etsy, the business world doesn't know about Etsy. So you're starting to think about and do like writing your prospectus. You think about you're meeting investment bankers, you're picking an exchange, and we went public on NASDAQ, and you're even picking like what are the KPIs that we're going to share with the street. And so you look at things like eBay, even though it's different from Etsy, it's comparable, and you spend a lot of time with investment bankers.
And was it exciting going public? Was it stressful?
I think it was pretty exciting. And
because I remember Etsy going public very clearly, and the excitement from the outside. But
and one of the reasons, like this is kind of lost to history, like, and this is a thread through my time as a leader, and it helped me and hurt me sometimes. I wanted to do everything like differently.
Yeah.
And so one of the themes.
Dutch auction. Or?
We didn't do a Dutch auction, although Bill Hambrecht, who created the Dutch auction, came to me and tried to convince me, and I was like, no, I've already been through that. But I said, I want this to be like a Main Street IPO, not a Wall Street IPO. And this got some coverage. There was a really long article in the Wall Street Journal about it, but we set up an offering where Etsy sellers and really anyone in the public could buy into our IPO. This was never publicly reported, but we sold shares to, like, when I say share to the public, like that means the like initial allocation, because the public can buy them from the institutional investors, but they're not initially allocated to the what they call the retail sector that much.
Yeah.
We sold more shares to retail, regular people, than any other IPO except Facebook at the time.
Wow.
And in fact, our banker was Michael Grimes, who did the Facebook IPO, Google IPOs.
Yeah. Did a lot of sellers also buy in? Because I do know that there's a lot of, at least at that time, I sensed that there was a feeling of community and belonging that a lot of sellers had to the platform.
Yeah, so we sold to a lot of sellers. And I think, when you do a roadshow, it sounds kind of glamorous, and parts of it are glamorous, but like you're just kind of going from like conference room to conference room inside of Fidelity and T. Rowe Price and those kinds of places. But we decided that we were going to launch our roadshow with wealth managers, like in sort of all American towns. So like the institutional roadshow, which is what everybody does, was second. But the first part, we went to like a Merrill Lynch office in Red Bank, New Jersey. We went to Cleveland and Milwaukee. Like none of these people get visited, and these are people who are managing money for people in the community. Yeah. And just like you pitch the portfolio managers of like the big Wall Street firms, we were pitching these people who are managing people's money in these communities, and they were really excited to see us because no IPOs came around to see them. And that was part of what drove the retail interest. So that was really cool. And even when we chose the exchange, we could choose New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ. We chose NASDAQ mainly because the NASDAQ is in Times Square, and as much as New Yorkers kind of like make fun of Times Square, like the American public and the larger world thinks of Times Square as like the center of the universe. It's crossroads of the world. That's what it is. And so we were like, we want to do an IPO that's like consistent with our, power to the people. And so we did the NASDAQ IPO and had like a big craft fair. Like that day you could come out and meet Etsy sellers and buy things.
Oh, very cool.
And so we had Etsy sellers like ringing the bell with us. They had these little vintage bells that you could buy on Etsy.
Okay.
And so we, Wall Street traders, they talk amongst each other. And I got feedback that I still think is pretty hilarious. Like, someone was telling me, like, a lot of the hedge fund people think that you're arrogant. And I was like, what do you mean? They're like, all this, like, people stuff, and, like, you're going to talk to, like, Merrill Lynch branch in Red Bank, New Jersey before you're coming to our firm, and, like, what got into you?
That's sort of an interesting translation of the word arrogant. There,
right. To this day, I'm kind of proud that they called me arrogant. It didn't serve me well in the end, but I think they... not everybody, but some of them really didn't appreciate that approach.
So I want to fast forward a little. And you ran the company as a public company for a couple of years.
Yeah.
I've always had a great deal of admiration for the fact that you're open in how you discuss how you left the company.
Yeah.
That you're willing to embrace the fact that the board forced you out.
Yeah.
You didn't have sort of a neat little story with a bow wrapped around it of off to pursue new opportunities. And so what happened? I mean, you were going great guns. You had grown the company, taken it public, incredible success. I mean, what went wrong, and what led to that outcome?
I mean, and I'm not trying to pat myself on the back because I made a bunch of mistakes too, but one of the things that you hear when you talk to really experienced people when you're taking a company public is you got to really kind of respect the street, and you're going to have to pay really close attention to quarterly results. It really matters a lot, and all that's really true. And I think that I have a little bit of a rebellious streak in me, and I was like, I want to do it differently. And so one of the things that we did, and this was actually a mistake when I look back on it, and this isn't directly related to firing, but I think it's like a sort of ground that was laid, is we decided not to issue guidance. And so guidance being this is our quarterly target. And looking back, I don't know why the board didn't kind of fight with me on that, but what ends up happening is, when the quarterly results are announced, you hear people talk about, on CNBC, consensus estimates. And so the consensus estimate is usually an average of all the analysts, and they think this is where I think revenue is going to come in, and all this kind of stuff. And so when you don't give guidance, my message was, we don't want to get tied to quarterly results, but what you're doing is you're not guiding the analysts. And so they come up with their own estimates, and that's what you're held against. And so that wasn't a smart decision. You should give guidance just so that you can have a hand in setting expectations. So that was kind of a mistake. And so we kind of got beat up early on, and I think I was kind of on my back foot a little bit from the beginning because of that decision. And so I think that was a mistake. But I thought that Etsy had a chance to be a company that was different than other companies, and it could be a company that you know how there's always companies you love and then suddenly they're not good anymore. And you're like, what happened? And I'm like, we're going to be the company that's going to be really good forever. And so
I think all those companies also go through a phase where they feel that way.
Right.
That we're always going to be the good company.
And so I thought we're going to be different. And so this is very, economic in a way, but Etsy had always charged a 3.5% transaction fee. If you sell something on Etsy for $100, Etsy gets a 3.5% commission, $3.50. That was probably ripe to be raised, but I kind of liked the 3.5%, so I didn't raise the prices. I didn't drive the revenue as hard as I could have. And I think the street was kind of like, why don't you just raise the prices? And we don't have time for this sentimentality that you seem to have. So I was a little bit stubborn about that. We did, on a business note, it wasn't that I wasn't paying attention to that, but like we introduced a lot of new services that we charged for. So like we were making more revenue per transaction like during my tenure. I think we, you call the take rate, I think we probably doubled that rate. But I wanted Etsy to be like a really kind of like friendly company. Yeah. And so, I mean, really what happened, I mentioned this because I would have never guessed this is how it worked. Maybe some of you will be in this position. You go to investor conferences and you meet with investors, probably see these conferences like at hotels and everything in New York. And so your investor relations people set up these meetings, and the different investors, they all want to be like the most important person. And so there's like a status thing associated with having a one-on-one versus a group meeting. If you get put into a group meeting, you're with like a couple of other investors. And if you think you should be at a one-on-one, then the investor kind of resents it. And so I'll never forget this because it never happened before or after. I was at an investor conference in San Francisco, and I was in a group meeting, and there were 3 investors. And one of them was just like brutal, like mean. And I was kind of like, what's this guy's deal? And he just seemed really upset. And I found out he was upset that he didn't get a one-on-one meeting. And it's like a small conference room, as these 3 men were like coming out of the room and I stood up and shook their hands, the guy like bumped me. And I was like, no one has ever like, it was like in hockey or something, he like checked me, and I was like, this is weird, what just happened? And 4 or 5 weeks later, I was sitting at my desk at Etsy in the rare moment I didn't have a meeting, and I got this weird email that just said test, and there was a signature that was a law firm, and I did like what you do, I cut and pasted it into Google, and it was like, this lawyer is like one of the top activist investor lawyers in the country, and those are the ones who quietly buy up your shares and then write a letter and say, these are the things you should do with your business. It feels a little bit like extortion. And so I was just like, oh my God, this is some kind of psychological warfare. And then like 10 minutes later, I had a letter from the investor who like checked me, and they had written kind of their list of demands. And so, so this activist campaign started, and that was the end of me. Because they come in and they meet with you and they say like, we think you should raise the prices, and we think you should do this, and we think you should do that. And I would encourage you to read about activists. It's a very common thing. I even had like one of the activist people told me, it's kind of humiliating, honestly. He said, I want you to talk to my wife because she's like decorating our house in the Hamptons with Etsy stuff, and I think she might have some good ideas in addition to what we're asking you to do. And I was just like, oh, you're just like, oh, this is painful. And so what ends up happening is there's kind of like blood in the water, and then other people come in, and I think that they were like correct about some things. It was more of just like a timing difference. Like people like Mark Zuckerberg and even Evan Spiegel at Snapchat have super voting rights on the board. So like the board can't remove them even if they want to. And so in this case, there was just like a lot of pressure on the company. The stock price wasn't doing well, even though I thought it was going to do well probably in another 6 months. And so that was the end. I got a call on a Saturday, and the earnings call is at 5 o'clock on a Tuesday, and you can't really move the earnings call because that'll make your stock drop even more because everyone's worried. And so I had to, like, after like pushing everyone on lots of things on Friday, I got a call on Saturday, and we had to come up with all the announcements that I was leaving over the weekend, and then I had an all hands at like 4:01 on that Tuesday before the earnings call, because that's when the markets close, where I had to say like I'm leaving. But that weekend, you have to do like PR. There are a bunch of SEC regulations about these kinds of things. And so a key moment is they had written a draft announcement of my departure. Is it okay to curse?
Absolutely.
So
I mean,
they like lawyers and PR people, and they're all kind of like not even looking at me because some of them have worked for me and they feel bad, but we have this work to do. They show me like a draft press release, and it has a quote from me, and it said, I've enjoyed leading Etsy for 6 years. I've decided to leave and pursue other opportunities. And I said, fuck this. like, I didn't fucking decide to pursue other opportunities. This is bullshit. I got fired. And so they were like, okay. and I said, rewrite it. And in the end, like the issue, I had just been like pushing the whole team, people I'd worked with in some cases for 9 years because I was CTO for 3 years. And so to like be the CEO, put all that effort into it, leave the office at Friday and then come in on Monday and tell the people you work with like, oh, I'm just gonna go like open a country store in Vermont. Like, I was like, I'm just whatever. So I got advised by the PR team and even the attorneys, the Etsy attorneys. They said like, you're gonna like ruin your career. This is like really bad for your reputation. And I was like, I'd rather like do this right by the people I've worked with. I'll deal with that. And so they put out the press release. It was not as profane as what I just said, but it's clear that I got fired. And one of the cool things that happened a couple years ago is I got an email out of the blue from one of our lawyers who was in the room, and she said she had gone to be a general counsel somewhere, and I wasn't expecting. She said, like, I thought you were making a mistake that day, but like as the years have passed, I think that was like a really great thing you did. So now that I'm coaching, it's actually really good marketing. Because when I did this morning, when I talked to prospective clients, I tell them like, I've been through the whole cycle. Like, and so like if you want to work with a coach who's seen like success and up and downs, then like I've seen it. And I've taken the call from clients. I called my coach when I got the news, but I've taken that call from clients when like the boards like removed them. And because they know that it happened with me, they just feel comfortable talking with me about it. And
all right, so I
wanted to connect them with a lawyer immediately.
I do want to leave time for people to ask questions. Yeah, you got a microphone there.
So how, like you work in a two-way marketplace and transition from a tech to a CEO role. So any tips for someone in the product side to not overdo on features and get their updates right? Not overdo it, not underdo it, get it right. And are there any tips for managing a two-way marketplace, which is not like a return that you learned by doing it, rather than reading on books? Okay.
What I see people make a mistake is they think early on like too much about building the software and not enough about learning the market and talking to users. And so an area I didn't know a lot about until we built a really great design team at Etsy is user research, and that's a whole discipline that is super, super helpful. So like a lot of the features that we developed at Etsy started out with just people drawing on paper. Like, this is what we think the shopping page should look like, and if we put this feature on it, would you click on it? And a customer can look at that and immediately give you feedback on it. And instead of having a team of software engineers building that feature to see if people like it, you can just do it with a piece of paper. Like paper prototyping is the official name for it. So my advice would be do everything you possibly can before building the software. And this is something one of our engineers used to say, like the best software engineers do everything possible not to build software. Because it takes a long time, it has bugs.
Just want to say that I'm so happy to hear you say that, because I teach a class every spring with Albert Wenger.
Yes,
and
Albert's great.
And a big part of our class is actually, forcing teams of MBA students out onto the street to sort of observe customers interacting with products and sort of figure out what's wrong, and then to lock up little prototypes and actually listen to the customer and observe the customer.
Yeah.
And that's so much more important than feature-driven.
Absolutely.
My question is around your coaching business at the moment, and what's the one piece of advice do you currently give executives?
The number one piece of advice, it's really important to be open to feedback, and even more importantly, it's really important as a leader to be able to receive feedback and absorb it and then put it into action. I've worked with like 60 companies. I've probably done 30 360s where I interview all the stakeholders around a particular leader. And the number one problem I see is people rejecting feedback. And so the only client that I ever fired, and I just said, I'm not working with you anymore, was someone we went through the trouble, the team gave him feedback and I consolidated it, anonymized it, and I gave it to him. And he was just kind of like, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. And I said, well, we're not working together anymore. Incidentally, this is someone who is kind of independently wealthy, and I got a call from his COO after that, and he was like, that was awesome. It's like, no one tells him no. And he came and said that you fired him, and thank you.
When you became CEO, the top, you mentioned before that you rehired, like fired 17 out of the 20 people.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to know the systems and kind of like process you did to like find the right people and validate them, how you know they're good, long term.
The first thing you have to do is really have like a clear idea of what the job is. And even like organizationally, not only do you have a clear idea of the job that you're hiring, you have to have a clear idea of like the boundaries with all the people around that person, because a lot of times what I see when someone doesn't work out at a company, it's because a person was hired into an executive position and the CEO didn't make it clear what the boundaries were, and so like there's a lot of friction between executives just because of a lack of definition of the jobs. So I think that's really important. So like, to give you an example, like if you hire a CFO, is that person like purely a finance person, or are they going to have some kind of operational responsibility for a particular business or something like that? I mean, you were asking about the time I was like hiring engineers and like building the engineering team. I think in that case, and this is true for executives too, I think personality matters a lot, because everything in jobs is like really, really collaborative. I once had an issue with an executive, and this was not good feedback, but I got frustrated and I said, can you just please be more charming? Because he was really smart, but I was like, you just make people upset. There's, that was not good feedback. But I think chemistry, and when you interview people, not focusing too much on their past successes, because if you interview someone who's worked on a large team at Google, it may not be relevant if you're building like a startup. And so you want to make sure that they have like the contextual skills that you need in the current job. And I think you want to talk to them about real world issues. So like I was hiring a head of international once, and we were hiring a general manager for Germany at Etsy. And I had a stack of resumes because I was trying to hire the person before this person started. And in the interview, I just gave her the resumes and I said, which one of these looks like the candidates I should interview? And so that was like, I was simulating a real meeting that I would have with her, and I actually wanted feedback, and it was a real situation. So I think the interviews where you talk to people about sort of abstract ideas aren't as good. I think you have to talk to them about like what you want them to do, like in the context.
You came from a technical background, and you had to learn everything along the way about administration and operations. Also, so there were times when your values did not go with what board of directors wanted you to do. So how did you deal with failure? And as students, what can we do right to quickly set on this roadmap?
Yeah.
Always succeed.
Always succeed. This is really important. I think that you have to decide what success is for you. And so I decided that the kind of company I wanted to run was the kind of company that I was running. Being a public company is such a specific thing. I probably should have just gotten someone else for that phase. And I think it was my mistake to like put everyone through me figuring that out. So I think you have to decide what success was. And once I understood what being a public company CEO was like, that's not really success to me. And so think about that job and like think about there are things you have to do that are just things you don't want to do. And so getting removed was, it wasn't my choice. I was still trying. But if I had stayed and turned into something I didn't want to be, that wouldn't be successful. So I mentioned my wife said she didn't want to be married to a CEO. Later on, I asked her, was it okay for me to be a CEO? And she's like, yeah, it was, because you didn't change in the ways that I didn't want you to change.
Any advice for us as students?
I would say, define what you want success to be, because I see this a lot when I talk to people who are kind of in your position. Their idea of success is really other people's idea of success. And so it's I'm supposed to go to this school and I'm supposed to get this degree, I'm supposed to go work at this company, I'm supposed to be a CEO, whatever. And it's kind of what do you want to do? Yeah. Maybe that's it. Yeah, think about what you want to be. And if you want to, and I went through all this, if you want to be an artist, then that's fine. You're just it's going to be a hard road. That's a completely reasonable path. It's just got different trade-offs.
Okay, final question.
Do you have any reflections or guidance on building both sides of a two-sided marketplace as you scaled?
Yeah. This is a question I would get asked by investors all the time, and I'm stealing an answer I got from, I think it was the CEO of eBay at the time. I think it was John Donahoe at the time. But he said marketplaces are kind of like a pair of scissors, the two sides, and you need both sides for it to work. And so you have to pay attention to both. But I would say early on, I think what history has shown is that getting the supply in place is a really kind of the key thing, because if you bring in a bunch of buyers first and there's nothing to buy, there's no selection, then they go away. One huge advantage we had at Etsy, and I don't see other marketplaces like this, is that, and this was amazing advantage I didn't appreciate until later, the supply side, the seller side, were also buyers from the very beginning. So, and the original Etsy team, they observed craft fairs in real life, and so they would see there'd be a seller at a booth. At some point during the day, the seller shuts down the booth and goes and looks at other people's merchandise and buys stuff. So we had the fortunate, we had people who could be buyers and sellers at the same time, and I think that gave a lot of momentum. Whereas, Airbnb, you can't be a host and well, you can, but not at the exact same time.
Given how many people are still here, even though we've run over, this is a very rare that everybody hasn't gotten up and left. And I wish we could continue longer, but
there's
a professor standing outside who has a 6 o'clock class who's very unhappy with me at this moment. But
understood. Well, thanks everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you.